Hello, everybody. This is Jimmy, and you're reading with Jimmy. Today, we're going to analyze, discuss, and make some observations about The Prince, Niccolo Machiavelli's classic. Ready? This is a long one, so get your coffee. According to most sources, Niccolo Machiavelli wrote The Prince around 1513. Can you believe that? But it wasn't published until 1532, 5 years after he died. We read the translation by Luigi Ricci. In Ricci's own words, he said, "Of all Machiavelli's works, The Prince is undoubtedly the greatest. His, Machiavelli, whole life was an indefatigable and unremitting endeavor to secure for his native Florence a good and popular government. And as he lost his great office of secretary to the Florentine Republic on account of his avowed liberal opinions, it is not only unjust but ridiculous to accuse him of helping tyrants to enslave people. What he did was to show in the most deliberate and in the plainest way the arts by which free peoples were made slaves. And had his words of advice been always heeded, there was no tyrant in Italy or elsewhere that could have been successful in his policy. And that he was not listened to, and his advice scorned and spurned, wasn't Machiavelli's fault." So this is Ricci talking about the book that he translated and saying often Machiavelli is misunderstood. Now, if you read the book with Jimmy, and I hope you did before going to this analysis, you can judge what Ricci's saying for yourself. And we'll reserve judgment as we analyze it together. Because remember, when we analyze it together, what we're going to do is look at the Prince itself. We're not going to necessarily take what Luigi Ricci says or anyone else. And I want to give you one more. "Well, Jimmy, didn't you say that you never start with outside opinions and just go to the source?" I did. And I'm not violating my rule. I'm just giving the translator, Luigi Ricci, the benefit of the doubt and letting him weigh in on his wonderful translation that we read together. But I'm also going to talk about Max Lerner for a moment, who was an American educator and syndicated columnist and influential spokesperson. Lerner said a lot of things, but some of the points that stood out to me, and he wrote the introduction to the translation that we read. He was actually in the beginning talking about Machiavelli. Luigi Ricci, or the publisher, hired Max Lerner to write something about this. So Max Lerner said, "Machiavelli was in a position to become the first modern analyst of power." Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I think we talked about that already when we were reading it. This is a study of power. Where others looked at figureheads, Machiavelli, kept his eyes glued behind the scenes. He sought the ultimate propulsion of events. Why events happen, what moves events. He wanted to know what makes things tick. So Machiavelli rejected metaphysics, theology, idealism, and his whole drift of his work is toward what Max Lerner calls, political realism. Sometimes scholars like to use big words with adjectives, realism, political realism. Unknown to the formal writing of his time, very few people who talk of the Prince, pay attention to this, ladies and gentlemen, very few people who talk about the Prince have ever read more than a few sentences. Ladies and gentlemen, I applaud you, because if you read The Prince with Jimmy, you are now one of those few people who read it. Machiavelli entered, and that's why we're going to look at what he wrote and analyze it for ourselves and see what Max and Luigi said. Machiavelli entered our consciousness largely through the Elizabethan drama. We're going to read some of those Elizabethan dramas. Hamlet is already on this website. Machiavelli sought to distinguish the realm of what ought to be and the realm of what is. And what ought to be is idealism, and what is really reality. So there's a big difference between, oh, I wish it was like that, right? And then the reality of life. So if you read The Prince with Jimmy, you are now among the very few. And so unlike other analysis and discussions about the classics we read together, this one doesn't start out with Aristotle. Oh my gosh. It doesn't start out with the plot or the character. Why? Well, because it's an essay, a book that Machiavelli wrote similar to Thoreau's Civil Disobedience, which is also an essay on this website. In the analysis of an essay, I told you in the one for Civil Disobedience, I said reading and understanding essays is slightly different than reading a novel or a short story in classical literature. But it's only slightly different, and here's why. I went on to explain classical essays like The Prince are still read with the intention of seeing how others lead their life and how to lead ours. That goal never changes in reading classics. Never. You want to read how other people lead their life to learn how to lead yours. And in the case of an essay, however, the narrator is the author. You understand? In fiction, you will recall our narrators are either inside the story, first person, or outside the story, third person. John ran the course. That's outside. I ran the course. That's inside, talking to us, the reader. In the case of an essay, the author, Niccolo Machiavelli, is in fact the narrator, and he's inside the story, but he's really outside the story talking to Lorenzo, as we'll find out. And you will find out if you read this book with me. All right? So we may or may not know the inside one, but we never know the outside one in classical literature. The outside one is the omniscient, godlike character. John ran the course. We don't know who says that. In an essay, the narrator is inside the essay, talking, right? And it becomes classified as nonfiction, since the narrator in this case is the author Machiavelli. In the first chapter, Machiavelli tells us who he is writing his book to and why, if you'll recall. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. You remember he was writing it to Lorenzo, right? So he's not talking to us. He's talking to Lorenzo. And we're kind of eavesdropping on what Machiavelli's telling Lorenzo. Like fiction, the inside narrator is subject to being human, which means Machiavelli, his opinions, points of view, and maybe he's not telling the truth, or he's expressing to Lorenzo what he believes to be true, but we don't know it's completely true. Why? Because he's a human being like us. He's flawed. But when you read Machiavelli, when you read anybody who writes an essay, like we did with Thoreau, you judge yourself whether or not this guy's telling the truth. In this case, he's writing to Lorenzo on how to be a good prince. So it's doubtful he was lying, because Lorenzo was the man in power, and you don't lie to the prince, right? He's trying to help Lorenzo, although we already know Lorenzo probably never he never read the book. That doesn't matter. We did. In fiction, careful reading will reveal liars. Sorry. All right. In fiction, careful reading will reveal liars. For example, Ernest Hemingway's Farewell to Arms is on my website. So when you read Farewell to Arms, we're reading Lieutenant Henry, who's inside the story. And you will find out when you read that story with Jimmy that Lieutenant Henry doesn't always tell the truth, or he bends the truth, or whatever. So in nonfiction, careful reading will also reveal liars. Why was I spelling that way? But the purpose of an essay is different than telling a story. What is an essay? Now you're saying, Jimmy, I thought we were going to analyze The Prince. We are, but this is very important background, because when you analyze anything, you have to put it into context. You got to know who's talking to you, who's saying this. For example, when you read crap on social media, you may think that you're reading something that somebody said, but maybe it's a bot. You don't know. Or somebody you do know says something and you think it's the truth, but you don't know. You don't know, right? In the case of fiction or nonfiction where we have printed words in front of us, we have the evidence right in front of us. So what's an essay? Google will define an essay as a piece of writing that analyzes and evaluates a topic or issue from a personal perspective. That makes sense, doesn't it? They add often with an academic purpose. Well, I think you can ignore that last academic phrase because essays were written in classical literature for many reasons, not just for academia. Machiavelli was not writing this for schools. He was writing this to Lorenzo, the Magnificent. So essays are usually shorter and less formal than a dissertation or thesis. Jimmy did a dissertation and thesis when he was for his master's degree. And it's still in the library. I'm not going to tell you the school, which are more associated with academia. Essays can be subjective, factual, interpretive, and they can be used to inform or persuade readers. And you remember writing essays in school, perhaps, and can take many different forms. And in The Prince, Machiavelli tells us in the first paragraph, which I tell you in classical literature, the first paragraph, the first sentence, the first page is always the most important thing to frame the piece of classical literature that you're going to read. So in The Prince, Machiavelli tells us why and to whom he's writing this. Look at this, big bold letters. Niccolo Machiavelli to Lorenzo the Magnificent, the son of Pietro de' Medici. Now, if you're curious, you can look up the Medicis. There's been several series produced on Netflix and streaming, things like that. Here he goes. It is customary for those who wish to gain favor of a prince to endeavor to do so by offering him gifts of those things which they, the prince, holds most precious, and in which they, the prince, know him to like a special delight. So when you go to someone's house, you don't want to bring them something they might not like, right? So it's customary for, if you want to gain favor, you give the prince something that is going to delight him. So in this way, princes are often presented horses and arms and cloth of gold and gems and ornaments worthy of their grandeur. In my desire to offer your highness, see, he calls him your highness, wow, some humble testimony of my devotion, I have been unable to find among my possessions anything which I hold so dear or esteem so highly as that knowledge of the deeds of great men which I have acquired through long experience of modern events and a constant study of the past. So that's what he's offering Lorenzo, is his knowledge of great men and their deeds. And so, says Machiavelli, it's necessary to be a prince to know thoroughly the nature of people, and one of the populace to know the nature of the princes. This is very important. He's telling the prince, you got to know your people, and the people got to know you. And may I trust, therefore, that your highness, Lorenzo, will accept this little gift, his book, in the spirit in which it is offered. And if your highness will design to pursue it, design to pursue it, you will recognize in it my ardent desire, my real, true desire, that you may attain to that grandeur which fortune and your own merits presage you, which put you in, fortune and your own merits put you in to be the prince. Short, sweet. Of course, since you read The Prince with Jimmy, you already know that Lorenzo probably never read it, as I mentioned several times during the reading. Hey, Jimmy should have proofed this, huh? But the good news is we did, right? We did read it. Lorenzo missed out on it. But it really doesn't matter because Lorenzo didn't read it. What matters is we did. And it's important in reading any classic to pay attention to what is being said, not only in context, but because it's an essay and we can bring in our own reality eventually. And that is, we can bring in our own experiences and compare them to the narrators. In other words, we can start judging, is this good advice? Is this how I should be leading my life? What's he telling me? While we can do this with fiction, same thing. For example, we can observe a character in a story and always ask, would I do that? In nonfiction, the question is, do I believe that? And for those who say, wait, Jimmy, I'm not a prince. Why should I care? Well, Jimmy answers, if you are interested in power, and you should be interested in power, because power is around you your whole life, you should have learned something from reading this book. Someday, if not already, you will be in a position of authority, a position of power. And you may not be a prince, but you may be a manager, a boss, a teacher, a parent, a CEO. What our friend Machiavelli teaches us about gaining and holding power applies regardless of your title. Regardless. Now, you're going to say, well, how do I know it's true, Jimmy? Well, that's what we're going to talk about in the analysis, aren't we? Of course, we have to take into consideration the time period in which the narrator is writing. But that really doesn't change the fact of being human. Now, in those days, women did not hold the same station that they do today. They're equal, right? In those days, women were considered not equal. So sometimes he uses analogies differently, right? Forget about all that. Don't judge, he doesn't know anything. Women are equal. Forget about that. You shouldn't pay attention to that. You should pay attention to what he's talking about, power, whether you're a man, a woman, whatever. Remember, read to find out how others lead their life and how to lead yours. Okay? If you have questions, Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com, Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. So while an essay is certainly a different type of writing than a novel or a short story, it's nevertheless classical if it's on this website. I only put classical literature on my website. And as Camus said, Albert, it's not so much the soundness of the argument that counts, but for the argument to make you think. And ladies and gentlemen, Machiavelli does an excellent job of making us think. I hope you believe that. I hope you read it with me and you're not cheating by just reading this analysis. So therefore, just as fiction literature, we never start an essay by learning about the author in advance. Who cares how Machiavelli grew up? You can read it on your own time. But we let the essay itself bring out details that we have to, quote, fill in to help us better understand and appreciate what the narrator, Machiavelli in this case, is talking about. What this means, in effect, is that you don't have to know anything beforehand about the times Machiavelli was living in. In fact, those times should and do come out in the actual reading of his essay, don't they? When we read this book, we learned probably more than we want to know about Italy, than we wanted to know during Machiavelli's time. City-states, the wars that went on, the popes who raised armies, right? Hopefully, you've read the essay in this 8-part reading on the website. So there's 8 readings. And if you did, you are already realizing this is complex. Italy at that time was complex. It's extremely complex. And Machiavelli, as the narrator, has thought deeply about his topics and his intent to write about them to Lorenzo. He didn't just sit down and start tweeting or start posting. He has thought deeply because if you remember when we were reading, E.G. period appeared pretty much on every reading, almost every page, because he gives examples to what his beliefs are. He cites examples of great men who verify what he's telling Lorenzo. You remember that? If you don't remember that, go back and reread it. The main topic we're going to discuss today is what Max Lerner mentioned, power. Machiavelli studied power. How a prince gains it, maintains it, loses it, keeps it. You can Google and find out all sorts of opinions about the prince. Try it. Interpretations are too numerous to mention, but like all classical literature, Jimmy has told you over and over and over again, Read it for yourself and judge. Don't rely on, well, Jimmy, does that include your opinion here? Of course it does. I don't expect you to believe me. I expect you to read The Prince. What I'm trying to do today is help you understand The Prince from my point of view. You don't have to believe what I say, because what I'm saying is, even though it's absolutely true, it's up to you to believe it or not. That's true with anybody telling you anything, right? This is a study of power. Machiavelli studied power. If you did, this analysis and discussion will make sense if you read The Prince with me. But if you didn't, that's your tough luck. So I would recommend going back and reading it with me. In classical literature, you bring yourself to the literature. You don't dumb the literature down to you. I'm not, by the way, when I analyze this, I'm not dumbing it down to you. I'm adding a layer to help you appreciate what Machiavelli's writing. Right? I'm interpreting observations, but you don't distort. Like a lot of times today, what they're doing is, quote unquote, rewriting Shakespeare so we can understand the darn thing. That's BS. That's BS. You got to bring yourself to the author, to the classical literature, the way it was written. Or in this case, we got to find a darn good translator, which Luigi Ricci is. He's a translator. So what's the plot? Well, Jimmy, I thought you said you're not talking about plot. Well, of course, I'm talking about a plot. Everything has a plot. And from chapter to chapter, Machiavelli tries to educate Lorenzo about being a prince. And if you were to just take the chapter titles, for example, you'd get an excellent idea of what we read. But you would, if you just read the titles of the chapters, you would miss the entire point of each title. And if you just read the titles, you got to read them. You got to read behind the title of the chapter, which is what we did when we read the book. Machiavelli discusses the various kinds of government and the ways which they are established, hereditary, mixed monarchies, the way to govern cities, about those who attain power of a prince by villainy, so on. And he covers being a prince from every angle that you can imagine. These are all designed to help Lorenzo being a prince. Once you got into the essay, probably by part 3, by our reading by part 3, you should have realized, and in fact, if you didn't realize it, I pointed it out, that this is a study about one thing. That's all this book is about, power. A prince has power. And he gained it in different ways, which Machiavelli explains. I'm not going to test you on the ways, but you gain power, the prince gains power in different ways. And if you think this is only for princes, as I mentioned, you better think again. It's not. A CEO of a company is like a prince. He has power. A manager of a department, you manage a department, whether you're in business to business, like HVAC or whatever, you have power. A CEO of a company is like a prince, right? A father who has a family is like a prince. And so is a mother, like a princess, right? They have power. A teacher in a classroom is like, they have power. Power. Because if you're studying power, the question is always about who has it and who doesn't have it. Actually, it's an even tougher question is what the hell is power, right? We're going to talk about that. This is a tough question because we all have power to some extent. But we're going to discuss this because Aristotle taught us a lot of good things. Jimmy, I thought you said we're not starting with Aristotle. I hate Aristotle. Stop it. Aristotle taught us a lot of good things. And one of the things, the best things, is to define your terms, right? Okay? Power is one of those simple words that has many meanings. Your head spins. It's also one of those intangible words, isn't it? Power, power. You can't touch it. Sometimes you can see it and say, oh, look at. See a lightning storm. Oh, it's powerful, power. Most of the definition of the words that have to do with what are called parts of speech. Oh, Jimmy, is this going to be an English lesson? Every analysis, every reading I read with you, yes, everything is an English lesson. Why? Well, how the hell are you going to understand anything unless you know, right? Unless you know English. And English is comprised of lots of rules. Got to have rules. One of those rules are the parts of speech. So what are the 8 parts of speech? You should have learned this in grammar school, right? Nouns, pronouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, prepositions, conjunctions, and interjections. Got it? Now, here's a law. I'm going to give you a law. This is one of the laws I uncovered when I used to teach English, and that's a law that never varies. This will help you understand anything, technical, anything, if it's written in English. The way you use a word in a sentence determines its part of speech. I want you to remember this. Write it down. The way you use a word in a sentence determines its part of speech, which means a word isn't born a noun, an adjective, an adverb. How you use that when you speak or you write it down. Stop. See how I use that word stop? It's stop. It's an interjection. The way you use it in a sentence determines its part of speech. For example, I hate pizza. I pizzaed you. Those are 2 sentences. Pizza in the first one is a noun. I hate pizza. Names a thing, right? But in the second one, I pizzaed you. It's a verb. The way I used it in there is a word. Now you're going to say, what does that mean? Of course, you don't know what I mean when I said that. So we all of us reading together in life have to agree on definitions. If you don't define the words you're using the same way that the sender and receiver, as a sender, that the receiver defines it, you're not going to be able to communicate. And I put a little CF here, citing Humpty Dumpty. Humpty Dumpty, when we're going to read through the Looking Glass, we already read Alice in Wonderland on my website. But Humpty appears in Through the Looking Glass. And he has a philosophy. He believes the way he uses a word determines its meaning. And Alice says you can't make words mean whatever you want. And he says, of course I can. Who's to be the master? Well, if you want to make words mean whatever you want them to mean, you'll never communicate. We all have to agree on definitions. What a word means. Chair. If I say chair, if there's 100 people in the room and I say the word chair, I'm going to have 100 different things come into their heads from that one word, because we do not have a universal idea of a chair. Well, Jimmy, they all have 4 legs. Really? Could be. But what kind of chair is it? Is it fabric? Is it wood? You see what I'm saying? So the English language is a great stealer of words from other language, which makes English is very difficult. But Richie's job, or any translator's job, like Lysistrata, when we read that together, is very difficult because he had to take the original language, Italian, and translate it into English. So what about power? Well, dictionaries give us the words based on part of speech, as we're going to see in a moment. Dictionaries always take the word and then give you the part of speech with it. Dictionaries don't follow Jimmy's law. Sometimes they'll put it in a sentence to show you how it's used as a part of speech. But they don't really come out, they're just going to define the word. So scientifically, power is the rate of doing work. You understand? The rate of doing work. It is the work done in unit time. Ooh, it's getting deep, huh? The SI, International System of Units, unit of power is called a watt. When you buy light bulbs, you look at wattage, right? You see, even science has to agree on definitions. What if they said it was not watts, it was ohms? Pardon me. Now, what's a watt? Well, that's joules per second. What's a joule? Well, it's a force of 1 Newton displacing a mass through a distance of 1 meter. You see, once you're into the realm of science, we're going to have to be here for 3 hours. We're not staying here. Energy dissipated as heat when an electric current, blah, 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 blah. So what's a Newton? And I go on and on and on, and you can read it on your own. But we're not in the science realm. We're looking at power. What is power? So sometimes the power of a motor vehicle and other machines is given in terms of horsepower. All right, horsepower, yeah, that's power. So I'm confused, but let's keep going because that's not what we're talking about in Machiavelli, is it? We're not talking about watts and joules. I'm not going to read every one of these that Google gave me when I asked what's the definition of power, but I'm going to go through some of them and talk to you basically to show you why you really have to understand how Machiavelli uses this word. Because he doesn't really use the word. Did you see the word power in anything I read with you? Did you? Send me an email if you did. I don't think Richie translated that word. So as a noun, power, it's a noun. The ability to do something or act in a particular way. The power of speech. But even if you read the power of speech, what the hell does that mean? Does it mean that he's talking loud? Does it mean that he's using big words? You see, it's confusing. These intangible words are very confusing. Political or social authority or control, especially that exercise, especially that's a pronoun that they mean power, especially the power exercised by a government. The party has been in power for 8 years. What does that mean? That he's been in power. They've been in power, in control, right? Right? The sea power of Venice, and so on and so on. It means physical strength exerted by something or someone. The power of a storm, blah, blah, blah. Okay. It can be used as a verb. We talked about the pizza, right? As a verb. The car is powered by a fuel injector 3.0 liter engine. Powered by. Powered. It's powered. Is powered. Transitory, right? Is powered. They powered past the dock. Wow. So that's a lot of power. So we use power in many ways. So what was the power? What was that power, Machiavelli? What was that talking about? Well, unfortunately, it was none of the above. Because after all, power is an intangible and words that everyone claims they know and they use, but in fact, you can't touch it, see it, feel it. Or can you? Can you touch power, see power, feel power? I'm going to respectfully suggest you can. You can feel power. Can't you? For example, the power of speech. I went over that. On the other hand, if you were hit by Mike Tyson, if you were hit in the face by Mike Tyson, you would feel power, wouldn't you? I know I would. If Mike Tyson hit me in the face, I know exactly what the hell power was. But you don't have to define it. You'd feel it. So maybe, wait a minute, I have an idea. Maybe he's not talking about power like Max Lerner said. He's talking about force. 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 Force is defined. How do we define force? Pushing or pulling exerted on an object that can change its motion, speed, direction. Force. Yeah, now we're talking. Eventually, you describe any action that changes or alters the state of an object. Newton said, right? All things move in a straight line until acted on by some other force. They call it a vector quantity, straight lines until, right? Meaning it has magnitude and direction. Force is always the result of an interaction between objects. Push a door, pull a rope, stretching a rubber band. I'm going to tell you about rubber bands in a minute. So it sounds like force is another one of those intangible words, isn't it? Senses. Jimmy, this is a long windup. Why don't we get into The Prince? Well, if it's about power, I want to make sure you and everyone else listening to me understands what the hell I mean by power and force. We have 5 senses, though some people argue we have many more, but let's stick with 5. Sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch. These senses work together, and they help us to understand what's around us. Would you agree with that? I don't think anybody would argue that. That's the way we experience the world. We see it, we hear it, we smell it. In classical literature, like in life, understanding the world around us using our senses means that we see and hear what people and characters are doing. Food, for example, you see it, you smell it, you taste it, and then you judge quality. With people, you see them, you listen to them, and sometimes you might smell them. Little smiley face. With intangible words, like we're talking about, power and force, our senses all have to go by to understand and appreciate them. All we have are our senses to go by. We can't, if we're going to understand power and force, we have to do it with our senses. And that, somehow, like the Mike Tyson example. So I've discussed my favorites many, many times. Freedom, and many, many stories on this website, if not all of them. Maupassant's Two Friends, I encourage you to read that, is a story about freedom. So in Machiavelli's study, if he studied power or force, that means to make sense because he was trying to tell Lorenzo how to be a prince through his observations, you have to understand power and force. You become and you stay a prince with the proper use of power or force. And you demonstrate power or force by what you say and what you do. And you don't have to be a prince to understand what I just said. That's how you demonstrate power or force. Right? Before I go on, let me put this in context. Machiavelli said, I conclude then by saying that no prince is secure without his own troops. On the contrary, he is extremely dependent on fortune, on luck, having no trustworthy means of defense in a time of trouble. And that one's own troops are those composed either of subjects or of citizens or of one's own dependents, and all others are mercenaries and auxiliaries. So he's saying that a prince is secure. Remember, he's got to be secure to hold on to his power through luck, right? Or depending on himself. That's how you hold power. You can't rely on mercenaries or auxiliary. You remember? He talks a lot about warfare in here because not only was Italy fighting each other all the time, but that's how a prince rises to power. So he should have his own prince to stay in power. And that without them, the prince is entirely dependent on fortune. Do you depend just on good luck? The other types of armies that he talks about are not reliable. So actually, ladies and gentlemen, The Prince is a treatise on war because a prince was always at war, pretty much. And the force and the power was a way he gained and sustained power. And the evidence Machiavelli gives runs throughout history. You'd think, well, Jimmy, I don't believe in war. Have you looked around? Have you looked around the world? I don't care if you're reading, what year you're reading this. I don't really care. Have you looked around the world? Have you? This is not like H.G. Wells, the Eloi, right, and the Morlocks. You know, the time machine where the Eloi were always just there they were. And the Morlocks used to eat them because they didn't know anything. The Eloi didn't know anything. There's wars all the time. There's wars within families. So the answer to my question of what a prince should be doing all the time is studying war. And here's Machiavelli. A prince should therefore have no other aim or thought, nor take up any other thing for his study, but war and its organization and discipline. for that is the only art that is necessary to one who commands. And it is of such virtue that it not only maintains those who are born princes, but often enables men of private fortune to attain that rank. And one sees, on the other hand, that when princes think, da, 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 da. You understand? Study of warfare. Men of private fortune, can rise to the rank of prince, working your way to the top. You study warfare, right? You study hard. War is defined, how do you define war? Conflict, carried on by force of arms, as between nations, parties, nation. Warfare is by land, sea, air, but conflict is actually much more. Conflict can be an argument you have with a loved one, can't it? It's what you feel when you're torn between studying and watching a football game. You're in conflict. The encounter that you have when someone cuts you off on the road, you're in conflict. Should I chase him? But you see, your senses still are all involved in these words, aren't they? Conflict. Your senses, you feel things, right? You see things, you hear things, you smell, you feel. There are two words in the definition of conflict that are of particular importance to the prince: conflict and force. War is when one side wants to force the other side to do something that the other side doesn't want to do. Everything else is negotiations, doing things to avoid conflict. And if you think that conflicts that we read in The Prince existed only when Machiavelli was around, like I told you just now, look around you today. Conflicts don't have to exist in just states. They exist within families, arguments, fighting, sometimes violence. And conflicts are and have been and always will be around, ladies and gentlemen. Unfortunately, this is not an ideal world. And in between the force that is used to resolve the conflict, the other one is really through negotiation, compromise. You're negotiating. And yes, the definition of negotiation is, quote, a discussion between two or more parties to reach an agreement to resolve a conflict. You see how nice it is when you use definitions? Are you starting to understand? Words are amazing, aren't they? Unfortunately, you and I can't avoid conflict. You're already in conflict now. You're wondering, why does he keep talking about anything except the prince? Well, I touched on the prince. Because it's so important for you to understand power, force, and conflict, not just from the prince's point of view. He's trying to tell Lorenzo, if you're going to be a prince, you have to understand power and force and conflict. You have to understand these things. And if you're going to lead life, if you're going to be alive, you better understand those three words too. Because you cannot lead a life that doesn't have those three words. You can't do it. It's impossible. Well, Jimmy, what about a monk who locks himself up in a monastery and doesn't? He still has conflict. She still has conflict. She has conflict within herself about her faith, perhaps, his faith, perhaps. There's always conflict. Moments of peace are far few and in between, right? We have to almost force ourselves to meditate. I got to take a time, right? So my conclusion is that this prince is a study of power, force, and conflict. And Machiavelli is trying to tell Lorenzo how to do this. But we're not princes, Jimmy. Really? Are you in control of your life? That's a simple question. You think you control your life? I had a guy once who told me, we were having breakfast once, and he said, you know what I admire about you, Jimmy? He says, you're in control of your business. And I looked at him and said, I'm not in control of my business. He said, what do you mean you're not in control of your business? You know, to the dime where every penny's going, blah, 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 blah. I had about 25 people. I said, that's not being in control because you know where the money's going. You don't control your business. Your business controls you. Life controls you. It puts things in front of you that you have to react to. There's no such thing as control, which I'm going to prove to you in a moment. So, answer my question. Are you in control of your life? You may think you are, But if you read Machiavelli, you realize the importance of luck, of fortune, and the rules that Machiavelli gave Lorenzo, and how you can try to maintain control. Because if The Prince is truly a study of power, force, and conflict, that's what you have to do. You have to try to control these things that you can't control. It's very difficult to understand or use the English language to convey. Do you have any conflicts? If you have conflicts, you're not in control of your life. And everyone, ladies and gentlemen, has conflicts. Everyone. The Prince is about understanding what control is, what conflict is, and how you win it, avoid it, and how you lose it. And control is defined as the what? Power to influence or direct people's behavior in the course of events. Isn't that interesting? The power to influence or direct people's behavior. Isn't that what this book is about? Power? The power to influence, right? Machiavelli taught us there's two ways to fight, lawfare and force. Lawfare, the way men fight, force, the way beasts fight. We're going to talk about that. Machiavelli's written a marvelous book on how someone in authority, prince, CEO, has to try to control things so he doesn't lose his kingdom, his state, his business. And we can all learn from this book on winning and losing in conflicts. And here's a thought to get you started. Think about a rubber band, all right? Think about or take up a rubber band. If two people pull at the ends of the rubber band and they keep on pulling, I think you'll agree with me that eventually that rubber band will snap and break and pop right back at them. But if those two same people start pulling and one lets the other side pull, nothing will happen. Nothing will happen. The rubber band, for all intents and purposes, will remain in its original form. My rubber band example is a way to understand what we're talking about in this book. Power, force, conflict. Conflict is when two sides are pulling on the rubber band. Right? You're pulling on the rubber band. That's conflict. The rubber band can be anything. It could be an issue. It could be an idea. It could be a thought. It could be what you watch on television. It could be anything. That's the rubber band. And force is how you pull one side. How much force do you exert when you start pulling on that rubber band? They can pull slowly. Tension rises slowly as the other side also pulls, but you can pull quickly and tension rises quickly. Tension can be defined as the state of being stretched tight. So power is being able to pick up that rubber band to begin with. You have the power to pick up that rubber band, to decide if you're going to go into conflict, right? You have the power to decide to pick it up. And when you do, you decide if you pull or you let yourself be pulled. And if you know you are being pulled and you let yourself be pulled, let me ask you that question I asked you again earlier. Who is actually in control? Who's controlling it? If you let yourself be pulled, think about that. This simple analogy runs underneath this entire book. Pulling, right? Who's pulling? Who's not pulling? Movement. Little side. Oh my God, it's unbelievable. It's the give and take of power, conflict, resolution, and force. Chapter 18 is one of the most important chapters in Machiavelli's advice to Lorenzo. Actually, they're all important. Machiavelli says, you must know then that there are two methods of fighting, the one by law and the other by force. And the first method by law is that of men, and the second of beasts. But as the first method is often insufficient, one must have a recourse to the second. And if therefore it is necessary for a prince to know well how to use both the beast and the man, a prince must know how to use both natures. Do you understand that? Do you understand the importance of that paragraph in conflict? Do you? Read it again. So he goes on. A prince being thus obliged to know well how to act as a beast must imitate the fox and the lion. For the lion cannot protect himself from traps. He's just a lion. He doesn't. And the fox cannot defend himself from wolves. It's too small, right? So one must therefore be a fox to recognize traps and a lion to frighten the wolves. Those that wish to be only lions do not understand that. If all you've got to use is force, you don't know. You just don't understand this. Therefore, a prudent ruler, he uses the word prudent a lot. A prudent ruler ought not to keep faith when by doing so it would be against his interest. In other words, don't keep faith. Don't keep your word when it's against your interest. And when the reasons which made him bind himself no longer exist, the deal is off, right? If men were all good, pay attention. If men were all good, this precept that I just gave you would not be a good one. But since men are bad and would not observe their faith with you, keep their word, so you, Mr. Prince, are not bound to keep faith with them. Do you understand how important this is in life? Do you? Think about that again. I tell you all the time that you read classics to learn how others lead their lives. And Machiavelli, what's he saying to Lorenzo? Not that you have to flip-flop or that you have to use force, your point of view all the time, or run away from a fight. He's saying you have to be conscious of you and your stance and your role on these things to maintain power. We read the meditations on my website by Marcus Aurelius. And Marcus Aurelius was an extraordinary guy. And he talks about being conscious of being the emperor all the time. You have to be conscious. In other words, when to be pulled by the rubber band. Machiavelli. There are three different kinds of brains. The one understands things unassisted. The other understands things when shown by others. The third understands neither alone nor with the explanations of others. The first kind of brain is excellent. The second is also excellent, but the third is useless. I've used that quote for 30 years in my business, in my year-end wrap-ups when I wrap up the year for everybody. There's three kinds of brains. Which kind of brain are you? He wrote, if you remember, when he was talking about the prince's choice of ministers, and he tells you, if you want to know about a prince, if you want to know about anybody, the first impression one gets of a ruler, of the ruler's brain, is from seeing the men that he has around him. Now, of course, women apply here too. Remember what I said earlier. So what kind of people do you put around you? What kind of employees do you have? I remember walking in to call on a publisher once, and there was the receptionist there, and I walked in with another guy who was making the sales call on me, and I said, "Is so-and-so here?" And she looked up, and she kept her head down like she was looking down at the desk, and her hand rose like a ghost, and just pointed to the direction where we should have gone. We kind of looked at her and looked at there, and she never had no eye contact. That told me immediately what the hell I was getting into. Immediately. Never, why would I waste my time? That meeting took 15 minutes and we were out of there. Three kinds of brains are really types of people. Some understand unassisted. They're the really smart ones. I don't know anybody like that. I have to read and reread and reread. I have to study. I don't have that gift of understanding. But understanding doesn't mean that they appreciate or know what to do all the time, just because they do. Jimmy knows a lot of people who understand unassisted, and they still lose conflicts. They perhaps have forgotten how to be a lion and a fox. In his book, Failure is Not an Option, Gene Kranz told the story of how flight control faced situations that they had never faced before. Chris Kraft, Gene's boss, told him and his team, quote, "The first rule of flight control is this: if you don't know what to do, don't do anything." Right? Krantz had made almost a fatal mistake that would have cost the astronauts their lives. So really, really smart people make some really, really dumb mistakes, don't they? Don't they? Because they don't know what to do, so they just do anything. Because they're smart, right? No, that's not the way to be. Sometimes you can't help it. You got to act, right? You got to act. And Machiavelli talks a lot about how a prince has to practice war, even in peacetime. Practice makes perfect. Just ask anybody who has achieved greatness in what they do. Ask anybody. And they will tell you practice makes perfect. Like Navy SEALs. Marcus Luttrell is a retired U.S. SEAL. He wrote a book called Lone Survivor, right? You saw the movie, perhaps. The book is much better. Here's some things from the book. I learned to stay right on top of my game all the time in order to deal with it. No complacency. You understand? These are important life lessons. I will outwork anyone. I will go on and on until the dust clears, and then I'm usually the only one left standing. Jesus, what a will, huh? Trauma taught me to be careful, to earn my money and invest it and get it somewhere secure. And it taught me to think very carefully about the element of luck when it's running and how to keep your life under control. This statement here about luck runs throughout. It's fortune in Machiavelli. Nothing just happens. You have to strive. You have to make it happen, etc. You can read these on your own. You can pause me and read these on your own. Okay? They're very good. They're very, very, very good. Other people, in Machiavelli's words, understand when shown by others, so they learn as they go. And there are many of us. Actually, we should all be lifelong learners because it's impossible to know everything, isn't it? You're not a doctor. You don't know what happens with your heart, with your veins, whatever. Machiavelli is trying to teach Lorenzo how to govern a specific kind of action, giving a kind of how-to book on being a prince. And it's very different than driving a truck or internal medicine, and yet there are similarities, aren't there? Aren't there? For example, while you can count on people in the end, ladies and gentlemen, sorry to say, you have to count on yourself most of all. You can be the best driver in the world, truck driver, and when you encounter a situation on the road, it's really in your hands, no one else's. There's a certain amount of luck. What if I left 3 seconds earlier, right? What do they say on the airlines? Put your mask on first before you can help others. A final group of people understand neither alone nor with the explanation of others, and these are the dumb ones. Jimmy, you shouldn't use the word dumb. Why not? You define it for yourself. What do you think dumb means? I didn't define it here on purpose. What do you think it means? I know I felt dumb. I'm feeling dumb sometimes. I do dumb stuff. I'm dumb. Because you lose focus. You lose your concentration. And you do a dumb thing. And we've all felt like this. But do you give up when you feel dumb? Do you sleep on the problem? Solve it? Stephen Hawking's, look him up, once said, it matters if you just don't give up. Never give up. So I would suggest that is because the third group is what they don't want to understand. It's not that they can't. They don't want to understand. They don't want to take the time to understand or whatever reason. And Machiavelli said they simply can't understand. Well, maybe they can't. And before you get upset at Jimmy for using the word dumb, we're all dumb, like I said. Jim Lovell was the commander of Apollo 13. And on the third day of the mission, if you recall, the oxygen tank number 2 blew up, and then tank number 1 blew up. So the astronauts were forced to return to the lunar module. It was a very harrowing experience. They didn't know what to do at mission control. But Lovell was on that mission, and there was, of course, a movie made, couple movies of Apollo 13. But Lovell wrote, quote, there are 3 kinds of people in the world. Those who make things happen, those who watch things happen, and those who wonder what happened. Do you think Lovell read Machiavelli? I'm gonna bet. I'll make you a bet. I don't know Jim Lovell, but I'll bet you he read Machiavelli. Which kind of person are you that make things happen? Do you watch what happens? Or do you wonder what happened? So that's the question you have to ask about. What kind of brains do you have? What kind of brains do you want? And if you listen to Lovell, what kind of person are you? Do you float through life? Do you watch yourself act? Do you jump out? Jimmy, I'm not schizophrenic. Of course you're not. Do you jump outside yourself and watch yourself? I know when I used to give presentations, pardon me, I would jump outside myself and watch myself I would direct myself, walk down. I wouldn't consciously do it, but I would. It's a very weird experience when you're watching yourself make a presentation. Not in front of a mirror, but in front of 100 people. So Machiavelli was talking to Lorenzo, who was in a position of prince, position of power, control, right? All of us, sooner or later, are in that position of power, control. So how do you act? What do you do? Do you act like a lion, a fox, both? Does it depend? Do you pull at the rubber band all the time? Right? Or do you let yourself be pulled sometimes? Are you the main clause or the subordinate clause? I'm not going to get into that, right? So life lessons in this book are enormous, ladies and gentlemen. And while some of you will think it's not worth your time, that will be your decision. But you're going to miss a lot, right? Even Machiavelli, he actually addressed this kind of, well, I'm not interested in this. Quote, "It is not unknown to me how many have been or are of the opinion that worldly events governed by fortune and by God, and that men cannot, by their prudence, change these things, determinism. And that, on the contrary, there is no remedy whatever for this. They may judge it to be useless, so that it's just useless to toil. It's useless to go to work. And let's just be ruled by chance." Right? Machiavelli says, "This opinion has been more held in our day from the great changes that we have seen and they're daily seen beyond the human conjecture. And when I think about these things," says Machiavelli to Lorenzo, "at times I'm kind of inclined to share that opinion that everything is determined, why struggle? But nevertheless," Machiavelli goes on, "our free will may not be altogether extinguished, I think. It may be true that fortune is the ruler of half of our actions, but that fortune, allows the other half to be governed by us. And I would compare her, fortune, to an impetuous river that, when turbulent, inundates the plains, casts down trees, removes the earth like a flood, right? Everyone flees and everything yields before the fury of the flood. And yet, through some kind of thing, still when it is quiet, men can make provisions, prudence, against it by building dikes and banks, so that when it rises again, it'll go into a canal or it'll rush and it won't be so wild and dangerous. And so it is, says Machiavelli, with fortune, which shows her power where no measures have been taken to resist her, and directs her fury where she knows there's no dikes." So he's saying if you're not prepared, you're just screwed. You understand? Machiavelli makes a lot of sense. He does this. He talks a lot about being prudent. What's prudence? Prudence is the ability to govern and discipline yourself. Yourself, ladies and gentlemen, by the use of reason. Right? Lion cannot help it. He's a lion. He doesn't reason. He doesn't think. We watch an osprey from where we live. He comes most nights. He comes. He sits in the tree. He sleeps in the tree. Osprey's an awesome bird of prey, but he's just a bird. He doesn't reason. Well, how do you know that, Jimmy? Well, he hasn't talked to me. He does the same thing every night. Yeah, every night. It also means you have sagacity, foresight, discernment, to make good judgment, shrewdness. Finally, prudence means skill and good judgment and use of resource. But you're not born prudent. You learn to be prudent. Practice. And you actually, because things change constantly, fortune changes constantly, doesn't it? You can't put your foot in the same river twice, as Marcus Aurelius Heraclitus said, rather. Learning to be prudent is a lifelong experience and so difficult to put in words. Prudence, like force, conflict, right? It's one of those intangible words. Being prudent sums up how we should really lead our lives and what the Prince is all about. Being prudent when it comes to power, force, conflict. Wouldn't you agree? This analysis examines some of what Machiavelli said about governing. And I think that we should take this not only as governing a state, but governing ourselves. It would be impossible to take every lesson in this analysis, but Jimmy wants to focus on some of the ones that stood out to him. Okay? Would that be okay with you? But we're going to stop there, for this is part 1 of the analysis. And then we're going to go back and we're going to do part 2, because this has been a long one so far, I think. We're only on page 19. Oh my gosh. How many pages are there, Jimmy? 39. Oh my gosh. We're halfway there. Halfway. So we're going to stop there. You've been reading with Jimmy. This is the analysis. I'm going to drop down to this one. This is Reading with Jimmy and concludes the analysis of part 1 of Niccolo Machiavelli, The Reading of the Prince, and I hope you enjoyed it. Come back for part 2. It's on the website already. And remember, classical literature can be read and reread, and you'll always gain additional insights. Be sure to visit and read other classics. And remember, if you have questions, Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com, Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. Come back for part 2. It's all about the Prince. That was just the big, long wind-up that you needed to understand what the hell I'm going to be talking about. Got it? Thanks. See you soon. Bye.